For this one, for this video, we're going to be looking at the way the actual political spectrum works, and specifically, we're going to be looking at accusations of how people get called Hitler or the Nazi Party, and how people try to accuse that of being right wing. And where the initial accusation of that being called the right wing came from was actually through a Google search. Google initially had on the definition of the Nazi Party as a right-wing party. Now, this has since been fixed, but we see since that to actually show that it's a socialism. Now, what we need to understand is what socialism is and what communism and other Marxist theories are. They're essentially just statism. What a statist means is government controlled. And the reason why I go to the advocates.org is because it's the best system to actually view the way government works and the way systems work. When we look at the right here, we see that the right is going to give you economic liberty, but not focused on personal liberty. They usually have no opinion on personal liberty. The left is going to give you personal liberty, but have no opinion on economic liberty. A centrist is going to tend to give you a little bit of both, but not actually give you anything of value. When you get to the statism, this is where you get to communism, Marxism, and stuff like that. This is where you get more government control. Now, a lot of people on the left and neocons on the right tend to fit into this realm. And even some centrists tend to blend into these as well. People who claim themselves as centrist or moderates, because they'll push a lot of government control, and even people that push the status quo of what we currently have would be a statist. This is someone who basically pushes for a lot of government control of things and a lot of centralization of things, and doesn't push for as much personal freedom. And then you have back here with the libertarians. Now, if you lean either way, you could become a right or left libertarian. But in general, with it, you have libertarians back here which say they do not want government intervention on the lives of the people. Now, what we have with it is what Hitler was essentially a socialist. Now, what we have with that is a socialist is a statist. Now, we see that is far from being a right-winger, because that's up here. He wasn't a centrist. He wasn't a left wing. He wasn't a left-winger truly, because but essentially it would be leaning. It would be a statist. It would be leaning left, because there were a great deal of social programs, as you'll see in this video, that he did adopt, but they were still adopted with state control. And there was no economic liberty for people in the state. When it comes to people like, let's say, Mussolini, who is actually what they call fascism, which is essentially crony capitalism, if you want to call it that, he essentially would be considered lighter and more toward the centrist idea. And that's where we find that you're going to have a little bit more, but it's going to be a lot of crony deals with the government. And that's where you get people like that. Neoconservatives tend to fit over here on the idea of statists. They're still authoritarians, but they're looking more on the idea of you will have the economic privileges and liberty, but you're still going to have a lot of crony capitalism, and you're still going to have a lot of that's limited amounts of personal liberty and limited amounts of actual choice when it comes down to them. They're not actual true right-wing conservatives. And even with that, we do have still a limited amount of right-wing conservatives as is, because a lot of the right-wing conservatives we have tend to lean more as a libertarian conservative rather than a traditional right-wing conservative. And the left we currently have is either full-blown socialist right now, or more of this centrist statist that we're seeing right now, and that's what we're really seeing out of them. And you'll see out of this video, you'll see why Hitler was really a liberal socialist, and this is why when we see out of the stuff out of Europe, when they try to accuse individuals of being like Hitler or these Nazis, it's really quite humorous, because the EU system is essentially what they would call a democratic socialist, which is a revamped version of the National Socialist Workers' Party, which is the party of Hitler, and it's just a revamped version thereof. So essentially, when they're trying to accuse these people who are essentially in opposition of this, they're essentially accusing them by not supporting this new Nazi system, which they're calling democratic socialism now. They're essentially accusing them there of being a Nazi, which is essentially, by not being a Nazi, you're a Nazi, is essentially their accusations, which is quite humorous. But you'll see with this that basically it shows that Hitler's plans were very much in the same ideas of democratic socialism, and it's the same exact platform. And that's the whole thing.
Now, people have gotten really mad, and I want you to hear me. I understand this. We have a lot of people who watch who are not conservative, and we appreciate, who are libertarians, who are anti-social justice warrior, who are anti-authoritarian, but are not right-wing, and I appreciate you. And I definitely want you to stay here and have a dialogue. But I'm not going to pander to you like a lot of other people out there. I know there are winning issues like guns and free speech and feminism, and we can talk about that. And I know you get really mad when I do the Bernie Sanders thing. But you need to understand something. Economic authoritarianism is still authoritarianism. I wrote about this, that Hitler, what do we hear about Hitler? He was
super right-wing.
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 Nazi stands for National Socialist German Workers' Party. Okay? So put that in your back pocket. Now, let me get to something people will say. I know what you're going to say. National socialism, not democratic socialism like Bernie Sanders. There's a huge, one is fascism, right-wing, one is not. They're both socialism. Democratic socialism always becomes nationalistic socialism. By definition, it has to. Why? Okay. The United States is not a democracy. You throw around the term democratic as though it's noble. No. We're a constitutional representative republic. Why? That's important to know. It's important to know we're not a democracy. That's because democracy is mob rule. The reason the United States was framed as a constitutional representative republic is to make sure that the rights of the minority are still protected from the majority. Otherwise, the majority can just vote and screw the minority. You're more liberal. You should be on board with that. Democracy, by definition, would inherently be bad for minorities. So, am I saying Bernie Sanders is like Hitler? No, but the ideology is the ideology that lends itself toward authoritarianism and fascism because of an increased expansion of the state. Hitler promised employment for all. Of course, was a self-avowed socialist. Innovative public works schemes gave workers increased benefits. He increased jobs by increasing the state, not allowing wages to rise with prices because he wanted people working for the government. He ensured everyone had a job. Big education, free daycare. You had basically an entire generation who were raised by the state. Nationalized health care, up to an 80% tax. Gun control, of course, implemented gun control. Abortion, was radically pro-abortion, blaming on the 1%. Back then, the 1% were Jews. None of these things are right-wing. None of these things are libertarian.
Now, if you notice right there with that whole platform, if you notice, all of those things you will find either A, in the Green New Deal, or B, you will notice that they have been brought up by people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders themselves. And and other democratic socialists themselves. These are actual things that they believe in exactly. Every one of these points have actually been brought up, and this is their platform. They believe in the abortion, they believe in the universal health care, and all these things are either A, in that Green New Deal, or B, it's been proposed in other different legislation. And this is the major point that needs to be brought up, is that when we see this, and when they say, oh no, Bernie's not like Hitler, well, when you look at the whole platform is identically the same. And all it takes is one person that gets a little bit power hungry and at that top with it. And frankly, there's enough people that have joined up with this democratic socialist thing that all you need is one person. That one person gets into power at the presidential spot, and then they start making the decisions. And they start basically saying, you know what, I'm going to basically start taking away people's property, taking away people's right to life. Because we had a president with Franklin Delano Roosevelt that decided that the Japanese Americans didn't deserve the right to trial and just tossed them in a work camp. And that was exactly what you saw that they were doing out in the Soviet Union, they were doing out in Nazi Germany. This was identical. And this was even before this was a quote-unquote progressive president. This wasn't even technically what they labeled as a socialist or a communist president. These ones are actually coming out as socialists out in their own. And the fact is you could easily see them doing that. And we're seeing it happen in these other countries. Venezuela is one that they label as a democratic socialism. They're shooting at people in the streets with people who are basically just doing nothing wrong except telling the government that they're sick and tired of starving to death. Now here we continue with the video.
Or a conservative. So let's get through. If you go policy for policy, there's nothing about them that's right-wing or conservative, other than the fact that you're going to try and attribute racism to conservatism because that's what you've been taught to do by your college professor. Now, why is this so important? Going back to representative government. Well, Hitler used the idea of democracy, mob rule, to infringe on the rights of the minority. How do we feel about the rich Jews? The rich lying Jews, 1%? Let's have a vote. Kill the Judens. The majority, Germans, it's democratic and it's nationalistic. They believe Germany was for the true Germans, not for the Jews. Democracy, nationalism, either way. Mob rule, the nationalists win. That's the whole point. And they infringe on the rights of the minorities. Now I want you to take that and change it for 1 second. Take Jews, switch it to the wealthy. Because the Jews were the 1%. I have these numbers here. Jews in Germany made up less than 1%. They use that a lot, the 1% rhetoric. Change Germans to working class. You have an economic version of exactly the same thing. Am I saying the working class wants to haul millionaires, small business owners into gas chambers? No. What I'm saying is that's what democratic socialism is. Mob rule.
One thing right there that needs to be also pointed out is if you look at the Nazi Party, they didn't start out by hauling off and executing. They actually started out by segregating the Jews from the rest of the population. This is something that could also be done, as we see in places such as Venezuela. They actually stole the property from these people, and that is something that a lot of these people, such as John Oliver, have actually paraded as a great idea of stealing property from people such as CEOs of companies, and actually stealing property from these people and say, give them to the quote unquote, give them to the people. You're not actually giving to the people. The government's just stealing it and keeping it for themselves. That's all that's happening. Now, when we look at that, we know that the actual Nazi government did not start by executing these people. The first step was actually to segregate them in substandard housing, and steal all their goods, and essentially that was what happened. And they essentially wanted to round them up and essentially segregate them for the rest of society because they viewed them as a cancer to society. That's essentially what the messaging is going across even right now as we speak today. Is they're trying to brand these wealthy people and business owners as a cancer on society, and that government can do better.
Mob rule Germans against the Jews. Minorities lose their rights. Mob rule Bernie Sanders. Mob rule democratic socialism as opposed to national socialism. Mob rule working class takes the rights of the wealthy in an economic way, while simultaneously, just like Hitler, expanding the state. Free school, bigger government, cracking down on businesses so more people go to public school, raise their kids in public daycare, work for the government, and you remove the power from the private sector, putting it to the government. Here's the deal. I don't have that much faith in government. The idea that Hitler was right-wing, no. He was a very, very emphatic liberal, big government socialist. Undeniable.
Wir wollen ein Volk sein. Und ihr, meine Jugend, sollt dieses Volk nun werden. Wir wollen einst keine Klassen und Stände mehr sehen. Und ihr dürft sie in euch schon nicht mehr groß werden lassen. Wir wollen einst ein Reich sehen, dass dieses Volk einst friedliebend und aber auch tapfer ist. Und ihr müsst friedfertig sein.
If you like this video, subscribe by clicking my...
Yes, if you see at the end with his with the piece of Hitler's speech, we see that basically Hitler was never talking about individualism as what would be spoken about from the libertarian end, but was actually talking about collectivism, which would always be noticed in the status end right here. Now, this is a major point, as you're going to see the same thing being talked about from socialists such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders. This is the same type of rhetoric. You're also going to be finding it from the EU superstate as well. You will never find this from people who actually want to speak out about individualism, because this would never fit to a rhetoric of someone who views individuals as superior to the state. Now, if you like this video, like it, subscribe, click the notification bell so you get the notifications, and make sure to share it all the way around social media, and make sure all your friends and followers or anybody public sees about it, and I will see you guys later today. Bye, everyone.